Hello everybody, my name is Jenna from Folk Rock Farm, and today I'm going to teach you all about how to start your own garden. Now there's some basic elements that you need in order to have a garden that is successful, but if you have these elements and you have some sort of determination to grow your own food, then you can definitely start a garden. The very first thing you need to know when you want to start a garden is you need to know what zone you are in. And what that means is a plant hardiness zone, which you can find online, websites I think just like garden.org or something. I'll find them and link them below. And you also need to find out your average last frost in spring and first frost in the fall. And again, this will just give you a timetable of how long your growing season actually is. If you are growing annuals, it's good to know your average last frost date, because you'll find if you've ever bought in seeds before that typically when it tells you to start your seed is like 6 to 8 weeks before your last frost date. So it really depends on your growing area, and there is no like one day where you should start your seeds. It really depends on your climate and where you live. So annuals are plants that you put into the garden every year. Perennials are plants that you plant once and then they come back or they regrow year after year for several years depending on the plant. Pretty much all the annuals that you're going to be thinking about putting in your garden bed can be grown in this time frame in your zone, especially with the help of a greenhouse or a garden center where you can buy plant starts. Now most annuals are going to be vegetables, most perennials are going to be fruits, but there are some perennial vegetables and there are some annual fruits as well. Now what you're probably going to be growing mostly in your gardens, especially if you're just starting out, is annuals. So it's going to be mostly vegetables, although there are some fruit you can grow. Basically most fruit in my area, and probably your area too, are going to be perennial. You can definitely do that, but for the sake of keeping this video a bit shorter, I am going to stick to just annuals in this video with the intention of doing a perennial video later on. And when I say vegetables, I mean more so in what we just think of as vegetables, not in the botanical sense of vegetables. Like for instance, like cucumbers are technically a fruit because the fruit of the plant is what houses the seeds. So I'm talking just, layman's terms, like what we consider fruits and vegetables. So, element number 1 is knowing your climate. Element number 2 is you need sunlight. You absolutely need sunlight. Now most plants, especially annual plants, are going to want at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight, especially your annual plants, because you're trying to get the most production and fruit out of the short season that it's there, because it won't be there year after year. You're just getting 1 year out of it. Any additional sunlight beyond this is fine for most crops. There might be some that would prefer a little bit of shade in the summer, like cool weather crops, but for the most part, if your little plot of garden gets sun all day, that's perfect. Now the second element that you absolutely need is soil, and good soil. I don't think I can stress enough the importance of soil health for your garden. If you don't have the nutrients in your soil, you're not going to get the nutrients in your crop. So a good soil, it should be dark and rich and fluffy and just filled with life. Microorganisms and funguses and air pockets, those all make up the qualities of a really good soil. And your soil should have good drainage. You don't want a low level of land where it's constantly wet or boggy. This will cause some root rot in crops and lead to disease. And you also don't want somewhere that's just super thin and rocky and you stick a shovel in the ground and it doesn't go anywhere. Ideally you have a really nice starting point and you have good soil, but if you don't, then you do have options. Option number 1 is to amend the soil. And the best way to amend the soil is to continuously add organic matter. Now organic matter can come into the form of any sort of vegetable or plant debris, so hay or grass clippings or fine grated wood chips. You don't really want to use wood chips for an annual garden, but I can get into that later on. So organic matter is essentially just like leftover debris from plants that no longer live anymore. So it is best to add a compost to your soil, especially if you're going to be using it soon. Compost is broken down. It can be several different piles of organic matter. It can be chicken poop, it can be cow manure, it can be scraps from your kitchen. But essentially compost is all this stuff that's sat there for a while, it's broken down, and now it has generated this really dark, luscious organic matter that is ready to go into your garden bed. So the thing with amending the soil is obviously it's going to take time. If you want to start it this spring, then you could start almost immediately checking out what type of soil you have once the ground starts to defrost. And you can add compost at the beginning of the season and dig it into the soil and remove any weeds as you go. Amending soil can also cost some money if you need to buy compost in that's already finished, but this still is more cost effective than what is your second option, which is putting in a raised bed. And raised beds specifically come in handy if the area you're trying to grow is not ideal. So if it's bedrock or if it's super clay soil, it's really compact and hard. If it is boggy, if it floods a lot, a raised bed would be a really good option for any of these scenarios. Or even if the soil is less than ideal and you wanted to start growing this year, then you can definitely put in raised beds. The thing with raised beds is it's going to cost you some money up front to actually get the wood or corrugated metal, whatever you use to actually build your raised bed. And then it's also going to cost you money to truck in soil or peat or compost, whatever you use to create your soil in the raised bed. Now, some pros and cons of this is obviously you can control what you put into the raised bed, so you can select some really high quality materials to build up your soil. It is going to have really good drainage, so again, if you have wetland, it's going to bring your plant roots higher so that they don't get waterlogged. But some drawbacks of the raised bed is also drainage, because if you live somewhere that's hot, it's going to require water more often because the water will drain out of it and dry up quicker than if it was in the soil. But again, if you have no other option because your soil is not ideal or you don't want to wait to amend it, then I would definitely recommend starting off with a raised bed. However, if your soil seems like it's in pretty good condition, I would recommend going directly into the soil. I personally think there are more benefits from growing directly into the soil than there are in raised beds. It will cost you less upfront, which is always nice. And if these two things aren't an option for you, you can get a little creative, and there's actually a strategy known as hay bale gardening, where you actually just take your bale of straw and you first have to condition it, so you water it a bunch of times, you fertilize it a bunch of times to get it to start to break down. Then you can transplant your plants directly into the straw bales and have them grow out of that. Now again, these are going to need water and fertilizer a lot more often than if your plants were in the ground, but the benefit to this is your plant is growing completely out of the soil, so you have 100% control of where to put it. If you need to put it into a sunny location that you couldn't otherwise grow in, or if you just don't have any other options, or if you are trying to amend the soil underneath, if you first grow in your straw bales that first year, the second year your straw bales will be too broken down to grow into, but then you can use them as mulch for your next season and your soil will be more ready to grow in the following year. So kind of a cool tip. And I will say that the best tasting tomato I've ever had came from a straw bale plant. It was really good. And I think there is something to tomatoes and fertilizer, like they really like to be fertilized. So the last element that you absolutely need in order to grow food is nutrients. And nutrients can come from a good soil, they can come from organic matter, and it can come from fertilizer. Now, a compost can definitely act as a good source of nutrients, especially if you put it on every season. We typically like to put on a 1/2 inch to 1 inch every season, either in the fall, prior to mulching the bed for the winter or in the spring before the growing season starts, and then we'll just till it into the soil. And once your crop is put into the garden, it'll be beneficial to fertilize a few times throughout the season. You will have to fertilize more if your plant is in a container or raised bed or straw bale, just because the roots don't have access to go deeper and to get nutrients from below and bring them up. So the last major element that your garden will need to be successful is water. Now, hopefully the rain cooperates and you get a shower every couple days and it's great. In a realistic world, this isn't going to happen every week. So be realistic about where you position your garden. You want it to be somewhere that you wouldn't mind hauling a watering can or a garden hose out to if you need to water it a couple times a week. In the spring, you could probably get away with watering once a week. In the summer, you probably need to water anywhere from 2 to 4 times a week, depending on how hot it is. Your plants will also let you know when they need water. You'll probably start to see them go a little limp and a little sad. And again, a container, a raised bed, or a straw bale will need water more often than if you were to just plant directly into the soil. But there are tricks to help you water less, and one of those tricks is to mulch your garden bed. And what that means is after planting, if you spread out some sort of material to create a layer between the soil and the air, we like to use shredded straw. So it's taking straw and throwing it through our wood chipper to make it just finer. You can also do this with leaves. You could use whole leaves or whole straw, but you'd want to take them off at the end of the season. You wouldn't want to incorporate them into the soil because they'll just take a little bit of time to break down. But having a mulched garden will save you a lot of time in the future between watering and weeding and just overall vigor, because that mulch is also going to be slowly breaking down and adding nutrients to the soil. So I definitely recommend to mulch your garden. Then we have some general upkeep when it comes to the garden, and this includes weeding, mulching, and pest control, kind of like the things you need to do between the gap of first planting your crop and harvesting your crop. So weeding, you want to take out any plants that come up around your plants, and you want to do this because they're going to fight your plant for sunlight and nutrients and water. So removing them when they're young is the easiest. You can go in and just hand pluck them out, or if you have a garden tool like a hoe or something, you can kind of scratch them out of the surface. But you want to try to do it when they're young, before they've really established roots. That way you cause the least amount of disturbance to your other plants. You don't accidentally rip them up. Pest control. Now I could probably do a whole video on pests and pest control, because there are certain pests that target certain crops, so there's kind of different ways of handling them. However, in general, the best way to deal with pests is early on and to physically remove them from the situation, because you want to break their cycle of breeding and laying more eggs and creating more bugs. If you catch them before they do that, then they'll be easier to handle down the road. So a few ways of handling pests is to squish them. Once you see them on the plant, just go ahead and squish them. If you get a little squeamish over that, you can fill up a cup of soap and water and just take them and flick them into the cup of soapy water. For all insects I've tried this on, they seem to kind of drown immediately. So you can do that. You can also take the bugs, kind of wrap them up in a bag and throw them in the trash. I had to do that with aphids this past year. They had just climbed all over my chamomile plant, and I just snipped off the parts of the chamomile that were heavily covered in aphids, because to go through and squish them all or to try to pluck them all off and put them in soapy water would have been, one, time consuming, and two, it would have been hard to be really thorough and make sure I got them all. kind of snipped the parts of the plants that were the worst and threw them in a trash bag and got them hauled out of here, and it really helped. So you really want to try to catch pests early on and try to decrease their numbers before it becomes an outbreak. Now when it comes to mammals and rabbits and birds, really with them you just have to try to put up barriers. For rabbits you can put up fencing, same with deer. For birds it gets a little bit trickier. You can buy netting for them as well, but insects and rabbits and squirrels are probably going to be your top garden nemesises. You might have to just kind of see what happens after you put in your garden, but I'd rather be safe rather than sorry. You can always get a rabbit fence to put around your garden. They're relatively cheap from Home Depot or Tractor Supply or any garden supply store, and you really only need about a foot when it comes to a rabbit. Usually that's enough height to distract them enough where they won't go in there. That being said, if you do find a few bugs eating your plants, don't feel like a failure and don't feel like you're losing the battle. And I do feel like there's this stigma around perfect food, and it has to look perfect in order to be eaten and to be sold. And it's really too bad, because if there's a piece of lettuce that's got a hole in it, or a little bug hole in it, it's still perfectly safe to eat, especially if you wash it. And it's just aesthetically it doesn't look the nicest, but it's still perfectly safe to eat. And I feel like we need to get away from this idea that all of our food needs to look absolutely perfect, because honestly, in order for it to look absolutely perfect, a lot of chemicals were probably involved in order for it to look that way, and that's a lot more dangerous for ourselves and the ecosystem than a couple chew marks out of your piece of lettuce. So basically those are the elements you absolutely need to start a garden. Once you've figured out how to obtain those elements, then you will be deciding what you want to plant. And basically I can't stress enough to grow what you eat, grow what you know you're going to want to eat. It's easy to get carried away looking through catalogs. That being said, definitely look through catalogs, because nothing inspires me more than to want to grow a garden than looking at all this beautiful heirloom produce. These are some of our favorites. We love Baker Creek, a great source of different heirlooms and really unique varieties and cool stories. Another one we buy from a lot too is Johnny's. They have really good bulk prices, so if you're looking to buy in bulk. We also get from Fedco a lot, but obviously Baker Creek here wins the award for best looking catalog. I mean, come on, look at this beauty. Grow what you want to eat. But for starters, here's kind of a plan. Some crops that have longer growing seasons and some crops that have shorter growing seasons. I'm going to tell you a list of both of them. Obviously the things that are quicker, you can get in a couple rounds. It might be easier for you if you're a beginner. And the stuff that's going to take longer, you might either need to start in a greenhouse, or you might have to buy starter plants from a garden center. Some of the quicker crops you can grow directly from seed in your garden are all sorts of greens, including lettuces, kale, arugula, spinach, bok choy, chard, salad mix, beans, green beans, wax beans, peas, snap, snow, shell peas, beets, carrots, radishes, and some herbs. And some common crops that are going to take longer and you might want to buy as starter plants, or you might even reconsider growing just because of how long it takes, are broccoli, cabbage and cauliflower, corn, melons, garlic, onions, potatoes, tomatoes, sweet potatoes, cucumbers, squash, and eggplant and herbs. And that's just, like I said, a kind of a basic quick list of the things that take longer, especially things such as broccoli or cauliflower or cabbage. You get the one main harvest like you're used to, the broccoli head or the head of cauliflower, and you might get a couple side shoots after that, but essentially that's it. So this plant took months to grow and you get like a meal or two out of it. It's kind of like, oh, what was that for? Something more like tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, where you get, you know, harvest after harvest because it keeps producing the fruit, makes it a little bit more worthwhile to put into your garden. And this is just my ideas for beginners. Like, once you actually really get into it, you'll find the time and the appreciation to grow things like broccoli and cauliflower and corn and melons. You might just want to start off more simple and get the crops that give you a higher yield without as much work. Now with cucumbers and summer squash, you can definitely start these from seeds in your garden too, just later on when it gets warmer out, but start them earlier, or you buy starts from a garden center, then you can actually get a few rounds in for the season and extend your season of cucumbers and squash. And now when it comes to herbs, there are some annual herbs that would not survive a frost, and that includes cilantro, basil, parsley, although parsley is pretty cold hardy, but it won't survive like all winter, at least not unprotected, and dill. And then there are some long-lived herbs, even perennial in most cases, like oregano, thyme, and mint, and sage, and these will come back year after year if, you know, given the appropriate location. And herbs are pretty easy. They can grow in pretty poor soil, so if that's what you have, then that's a great option for you there. So I should probably stop there because I feel like this video is getting pretty long. So stay tuned for my next video where I'll go more in depth about the different varieties of crops and how to grow the different variety of crops and how to start seeds. And I'll also include a video in springtime when I actually go out to start work in the garden bed, so you can actually get a visual while I'm doing it, not just like a sit down and talk. But yeah, stay tuned for those, and thanks for watching. Happy homesteading from Folk Rock Farm.